So 2 Thessalonians is, it's obviously the second letter to Thessalonica, or the church at Thessalonica, that Paul, the apostle, has written.
2 Thessalonians goes with 1 Thessalonians, two letters that Paul, it says, wrote to the church in Thessalonica. Now, we read in Acts 17, that Paul actually set up this church. So he visited Thessalonica and on a number of occasions preached in the synagogue there. And people were converted, it says. Some Jews were converted, some Greeks. And I think in Acts 17 it even says some prominent women were converted. So you've got a range of people in this Thessalonian church.
Whether it's actually the second letter that was written or whether it was the first letter is of some debate. Some scholars say, yes, it was written by Paul, but it came afterwards, and that helps us understand 1 Thessalonians better. Or they say it was written before, and that helps us understand 1 Thessalonians better.
In fact, Thessalonica, ancient Thessalonica that Paul would have visited, is now under, if you like, the city of, or the modern Greek city of Thessaloniki, which is in northern Greece, and it's the second biggest city in Greece, in fact. But unfortunately, there's not much left there from the first century, so if you go to visit it, you won't see much.
The large majority of 2 Thessalonians isn't really that different from 1 Thessalonians. Paul is writing to this church, encouraging them, saying, I know you're being persecuted, but know that your persecution is a sign that God has His favor on you, and the fact that you realize that it's unjust points to the fact that it will be really punished by God.
Well, in 1 Thessalonians, Paul's been pretty encouraging about the Thessalonian church. But in 2 Thessalonians, as the Americans like to call it, or 2 Thessalonians, Paul has heard that the Thessalonians have been misled. And in particular, they've been misled about one thing. Somebody has told them that the day of the Lord has already happened. And Paul's correcting this, and he's saying, no, the day of the Lord hasn't happened. Before the day of the Lord comes, a certain number of other things will happen, including the revealing of the man of lawlessness, as he writes. Then you will know that the day of the Lord has come. But don't worry, it hasn't happened already.
This passage of just 12 verses that's kind of out of the ordinary for Paul, and which causes some people to wonder if it's from Paul or if it was written by somebody else, where it talks about the way that you know that Jesus is coming is not is by the arrival of the man of lawlessness. And what this means exactly, scholars have debated for nearly 2,000 years. It says, let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first and the lawless one, or the man of lawlessness, is revealed, the one destined for destruction. So throughout history, in the Christian church, this idea of the man of lawlessness has been debated, and even today there's no definite ground on who it is. For the early church, it was thought to be Nero, who was a Roman emperor who persecuted the church very early on. For the reformers, like John Calvin and Martin Luther, they believed that it was the Pope, although the reformers describe the man of lawlessness more generally, saying that it's the Pope and others. But the idea that it also refers to, there's also the idea that it refers to the destruction of the Second Temple during 70 AD, when the Romans came and destroyed the temple.
And Paul actually interestingly says that some people have been misleading you, and they may have done this by circulating a letter in his name with this false teaching. So at the end of 2 Thessalonians, in chapter 3, at the end there, Paul says, look, I'm signing this letter so that you know this is really from me, that this is really my teaching.
It's signed at the end, I signed this with my own hand. It is me, Paul, who writes this letter. And some scholars say, well, I mean, it's a little much there, because maybe it's not actually from Paul. It's just someone's way of trying to claim that sort of Pauline authority. But I mean, the arguments, it's hard to make arguments from such few letters that claims to be from Paul, that it's not from Paul.
And that's important in a way, because some scholars, now modern scholars, would say that 2 Thessalonians is not written by the Apostle Paul for various reasons. But we've got to take into account the fact that Paul makes this claim at the end, I'm signing this letter so you know it's from me. So often we have this theory of pseudonymity, so the idea that it's actually okay to write a letter in somebody else's name if it represents their thought. But we've also got to be careful here, because essentially the letter is saying it's fraud if somebody else writes a letter in my name. So this is another element to consider in the argument for who wrote these kind of books.
Okay, so yeah, the way we get these manuscripts, or the way we get the Greek text, because we don't just have it in English, is originally Paul would write a letter. He may even keep copies of the letter for himself, which is why there may be so much overlap between 2 Thessalonians and 1 Thessalonians. So he sees what he's written before and he can write it again. But he writes that, sends it to a church. A church will collect. They'll keep collecting letters. They'll actually circulate letters between themselves that are considered authoritative based upon the teacher, and then they'll copy those letters, and you have to pay for a copyist. They'll put them in maybe a codex, that's a book, and they'll have all these letters collected. But over time, the letters deteriorate, and so they have to rewrite them. And so we actually have thousands of manuscripts, thousands of the ancient manuscripts, that is, some that are dated as early as 125 AD. And so if Jesus died mid-30s, Paul was writing up through the 70s, it's fair to say that these were written in that time period, but we don't have them until the 2nd, 3rd century, are really the earliest letters that we have. 125 is our earliest one. It's a tiny little fragment of the Gospel of John. It's called P52, and P just means it's papyrus. The way that we have the manuscripts to this day, that is, the manuscripts that we use to write 2 Thessalonians in English, is that we have thousands of ancient manuscripts, some dating to the early 2nd century, some much later than that, but they're just copied over the years by scribes and then passed through the church. One of the fullest early manuscripts we have, that's the entire New Testament, is called Sinaiticus. It's actually in the British Museum, and so it's got all these texts, including 2 Thessalonians, in the mix of it, and it just was preserved by the church, saved for years. So when we read a Greek New Testament, we have all this work that scholars have done to put together like a finalized text, and what they've done is they've taken the thousands of manuscripts and they've poured over them. So all these little letters here, these P's, that means it was written on a papyrus. These are all manuscripts that we have of the original letters, the original Gospels, things like that.
So in chapter 3, one of the things that Paul is doing, and he did a little bit of this in 1 Thessalonians as well, is he's saying, don't be lazy, keep working. And one of the reasons he says this, perhaps, is because some of the Thessalonians who believe that the return of Jesus is imminent might have decided to kind of give up their jobs and just wait for Jesus to come back. But Paul's saying, no, that's not the case. Keep working, keep earning your living. Okay, you can't rely on Jesus coming back. Or perhaps it's the case that they've become members of the church and they're relying on Christian charities. So they're saying, well, we're part of the church now. We're going to get supported by the richer members of the church. But Paul's saying, don't be idle. And in fact, Paul says that he himself is a good example of working hard. And elsewhere, actually, and so in Acts 18 and 1 Corinthians 9, in both of those we hear that Paul works as well as preaching. So he supports his own ministry by doing manual labour. We hear in Acts 18 he's a tent maker. So he's kind of a model for working hard as well as living out and preaching his Christian faith. So quite different, actually, from the idea now of priests who are in full-time ministry and paid for doing that ministry, where Paul works all day at his manual labour, preaches all night, that kind of thing.
I never knew he was a tent maker.
Yeah, it's true. St. Paul was a tent maker. So it's a hallowed profession.